Yay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So I had to put an alarm on to remind me to hit that button. Yay, it's recording tonight. So let's start. We're going to look at 2 Corinthians, Paul's second letter to the church in Corinth, but at least that's how we talk about it, right? So let's just start with a quick review of what kind of things in general do we remember about Corinth. Not necessarily the letter, but Corinth, the community. What do you guys remember about that?
That wild place.
Yeah, Sin City, like Las Vegas.
Okay.
Except worse.
Okay. What kinds of things? What kind of things? And what makes you say that?
I read somewhere that they had one of their biggest attractions there was the Temple of Aphrodite.
Oh, yes.
And there were 1,000 priestesses on hand at any given day, ready to go. That's a lot of employees.
Yeah, and right on a trade route. I mean, it was like one of those harbor kind of cities. I mean, it was right in kind of in the thick of things. So a lot of people coming and going through.
Very, very important trade route. It's in Greece, right? And so you remember Greece comes down and it has this little swervy part that sticks out. And so the city of Corinth is on the bay side rather than the seaside. It's on the bay side, but it's right at a little isthmus where it's really thin. There you go, right there at that little isthmus. And see how much of the peninsula is still left. And so the boats would come in and they could come from the seaside and then they could portage across. And that was one of the businesses, was to portage across. There we are. And so transport.
They had a special train track.
Right.
Set up.
Right. So they made a lot of money and income off that. Right. And had a lot of visitors through. And it was also strategically not only for merchants, but also for the military, very strategic place for military. And going back to what David was saying about the temples, I want to always lift up that from the Greek perspective, they had 1,000 priestesses and probably priests as well, right? Which is part of what Paul is talking about then. And then, but almost always the Jewish side, they just called them prostitutes. So on the one side, culturally, in the Greek setting, these were people who were honored. These were people who had a religious role to play. They were religious leaders. They were honored and they were seen as a key to prosperity, a key to fertility for the harvest, for the crops.
Big deal. Yeah.
Right? They were really honored people. And every time in the scriptures written by Jewish people, they're talked about as prostitutes. They might call them temple prostitutes, but they just call them prostitutes, which is a demeaning term, right? It's a derogatory term. And so you can see, the split in the understanding from, I'm a revered leader in my community to you're just a whore, right? You can also
switch.
Just then. You can see that a lot of the temple prostitutes wouldn't have a big reason to convert to Judaism because, you go from being a respected leader to nothing, to being a foreigner, outcast, a major sinner, and how much respect would you get? Karen,
that's interesting.
Right. And so in we remember that the spies, do you remember back in the Old Testament story where the spies went into Jericho, the Israelite spies, and they were helped by Rahab, the harlot?
Yeah.
Right, the prostitute. Right. And so she helps them with the condition that when they conquer, they will take her with, not as a slave, but as a part of the community. And then when you read, and later on, you'll read the genealogy of Jesus and it will have her listed as one of the, when you read it, there's not very many women listed in Jesus' genealogy, but all of them are women of interesting stories. And she is one of them. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, just kind of fun, but just because it's mentioned in other places in our New Testament about the prostitutes. And so you can read that as prostitutes, or you can also hold it in your mind, respected citizens, right? They had an important role to play. What else do we know about Corinth? Anything else? Or the letters? Let's look at the letters. What kind of, not necessarily the details of the letters, but just the background of the letters. Anything that you remember about the background of the letters?
Was he in prison was Paul in prison in Ephesus when he wrote this one?
Yeah.
No, he was.
Well, he wasn't a long-term imprisonment.
Mhm.
Almost everywhere he went, he got thrown into prison for he got hauled in for overnight things, but his long imprisonment was in Caesarea, which is on the coast of Israel. So in Israel, the highest point is Jerusalem. And so when you go downhill to the coast, that's where Caesarea is. So the leaders could come in from Rome, they could sail right to it. And it was much more comfortable because it's got the ocean breeze and stuff. So it's a very comfortable temperature. So that's where, like, you might think of the summer palace, where you would go there to have a cooler time. And that's where where Paul was held in prison for more than 2 years.
So he talks about fighting animals in Ephesus.
Right.
So did he did write 2 Corinthians from Ephesus though, right?
Yes, he mentioned what we read this week. Right. And that was interesting, right? Because there's not a lot of stories about him fighting wild animals in Ephesus. Right. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at it just a little bit of the technical then. We remember that the community is fighting. Another interesting thing I want to lift up about the Bible in general. So if you had a lot of different writings from different authors, and you were going to put it together and make a single book, a single volume out of all these other little books, how might you think to arrange those various books, right?
Well, partly I think it would depend on who I was,
Mm-hmm.
whether I was male or female or upper class or lower class,
Right.
to even start arranging.
Right. So for you, Nancy, if you were the one doing it, what would you think? How would you think to arrange the books?
I would arrange them by nature, actually, and by
Kind of like meaning
or-
by nature, like by genre.
genre too.
Okay. All right.
But I would probably arrange them from a woman's point of view, not through the male line.
Right.
Because Jesus, Mary was the mother and God is the father. And there is no male line into there. So that's one thing I would start with. And there were a lot of different religions at that time going on. Many, many gods, many of the Greek gods.
Okay. So who else has some ideas about how you might arrange the books?
I'd probably do it chronologically, like in order of when it happened.
Right. So that's very common for us today to think chronologically. Okay. Any other ideas?
That's kind of a more of a modern Western way of thinking, I think.
Yes.
I think we get trapped and hung up on thinking that the way we think is the way previous cultures and times also thought.
That's exactly, I want to lift that up, David, because the books in the Bible, they're arranged, a lot of them are kind of arranged by genre. There's a little bit of chronology involved. But but a lot of it is arranged by how long the book is. So First Corinthians and Second Corinthians, First Corinthians is longer, Second Corinthians is shorter. It might have been that actually Second Corinthians was before First Corinthians, but there wasn't any dates put on it. But when you read it, you could see how that might be. But First Corinthians was longer, so it's First Corinthians, and then Second Corinthians is actually probably at least two pieces of two different letters that have been edited together. And so they, the editors tried to make it match up so that it made sense when you read through it. But there's places where people who study it really well and analyze, they go, oh, this part is not the same. We're not looking at the same thing happening here. So thinking about it, we talked a little bit before about when Paul wrote the letters, he didn't write in chapters and verses. He just he usually dictated, right? And the scribe wrote it down. And then later, for study purposes, it was busted into chapters and verses. So those original letters were read aloud. Pretty much anything that was written was read aloud because there wasn't a lot of resources. Libraries were very noisy places because there weren't that many books and there weren't that many people who could read books. And so if you went into a library and you took a book and you read it to yourself, that was extremely rude. If you were going to read a book, you would read it out loud so everyone could hear. Everyone could start to learn and edify, and you would have discussions about it. So far from our current shh in the library, they were very noisy. All books, any book that was being read aloud. And it was the same with letters. When you got letters, you would read it aloud, and people would pass them around. You would share it with other communities. You would read it in different households. Everybody would read it aloud and it would get passed around, and copies would be made and shared with other communities. And so people would take the parchment and roll it up or fold it up and take it along. And you can see that it would start to wear out after a time. They certainly didn't have any expectation that 2,000 years later, we would still be reading these letters, right? A number of reasons for that, not the least of which is that they thought Jesus would come within a few years. The consummation of all the promises would happen. They didn't think that we would still be going on about our business 2,000 years later. They had no vision of the whole other continent being here, and none of that. So they just passed the letters around. They weren't trying to preserve them, and so we have pieces of parchment that have the writings on them that people translate and edit together, and from various sources, because they copied it, right? They copied it and shared it around, and so people find ancient parchment and it's read, and they'll go, oh yeah, I recognize this is a portion from this other scroll over here that we have, right? And they might go, oh look, this overlaps here, but it has new stuff that we didn't have before, right? And so imagine that if you're an archaeologist and somebody brings in something that they found and it adds to what you knew, wouldn't that be such an exciting finding, right? So anyway, so they pieced together this, what we call Second Corinthians, which might actually have been written first, but the chronology of that wasn't as important to the people who put the Bible together for us as the fact that the one was longer than the other. So, and when you look in the Old Testament, when you look at the minor prophets, what we call the minor prophets, they're not minor because they're less important. They're minor because their books are shorter, right?
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, so it's just kind of trying to get into the minds of the people who put the books and the writings together, how they think very differently. And so when we read through it, we need to remember that what they were writing, they were thinking very differently, and trying to get our minds into what they were actually thinking, and then moving that into our modern world, rather than thinking that the way the words have been translated, it means exactly the same now as it did then, right? which is really, really especially true for Paul, right? We all know the pitfalls of reading Paul extremely literally, and Paul is amazing, right? Some of Paul's writings are so beautiful, and the eloquence is just amazing. And then there's stuff that has just been used and abused literally and caused so much suffering in the world. And
There's a lot of churches though that they go for the literal stuff. I mean, it says these words and I understand it this way, and therefore that's what it is. And there's none of this reflection and wait a minute, let's dig a little. It's like,
yeah, I actually was in a Bible study once where, every week I would be going head to head with the people leading it, because they'd be saying one thing, I'd be saying, I understand it differently. And after about a month and a half of this, I said, God has created each one of us different, and we all have different life experiences and different perspectives. And so we come together to share these perspectives. And they literally said this to me, David. They literally said, yes, but I'm right.
yep. I've been there. I've been to those studies. Yeah.
So I stopped going, and I had a friend who kept going, and she said after about a month later, they said, wow, Jeanette never comes anymore.
Why? Gee.
I literally said, yes, but I'm right. It was just like, how are you right? But it didn't matter. Yeah. So anyway, so that's a little bit, just some interesting things about these. And so we're moving into 2 Corinthians, and go ahead, David.
There was a couple of things on 1 Corinthians that I thought might be interesting. I'll just sort of throw them out. We kind of zoom past these things a little bit. One of the famous passages, I think I want to say, it's not 13, maybe it's 11, and it talks about through a glass darkly. We see it's kind of a famous passage.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that the town of Corinth was known for making mirrors. They had a very special kind of metal called Corinthian bronze, and only they had it. It was prized throughout the entire Mediterranean. It was worth more than gold because they were able to mix various silver, copper, gold combinations with antimony and some other stuff. And they were able to produce essentially a mirror finish. Nobody else had this. So there was some other stuff where apparently that same metal was used to build the second temple.
Wow.
There's some gates. They actually made the whole gates out of this stuff. Kind of crazy. But anyway, so I thought it was kind of weird how Paul would reference glass, meaning a reflection, a mirror. Yeah. And I thought whenever the Bible gets really specific on something, there's usually a story behind it. This is an ongoing theme for me. And this was one of those specific things. And I looked that up. There's actually something called Corinthian bronze, and it was used to make these special kinds of mirrors. And you could only get it there. So when Paul talks to those people about, through a glass darkly, that's the only group that he can say that to. They're the only ones that are familiar with that particular kind of a mirror that was made there. I just thought that was kind of funny.
That's 13, chapter 1 Corinthians 13:12.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the reference.
And then the other one is when I was doing the whole thing on love. Love is this, and very, very famous. It's always done at the weddings. If only they knew. But in any event, one of the things that's brought up is envy, and that kept coming up. And every time I looked at that passage somewhere, envy always seemed to show up. And apparently that's a big deal. Envy. And everybody's heard of the new AI chat GPT and all that kind of stuff. And it's powered by this set of chips from a company called NVIDIA. And they specifically chose that name because that's the Latin word for envy. I just thought that was kind of funny. Envy, because we've got the best graphics card, and you're going to want our card, to do all this kind of stuff. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. But there's a whole big thing on envy that talks about with social media these days, the way everybody presents themselves as the perfect whatever, and the makeup and you know, I'm driving the Lamborghini, and they specifically set themselves up to be envied by other people. And one of the things in our culture now is a huge thing of depression. It's big deal. Depression is way higher than, you know, it's like ever been. And so there's some talk about depression, anxiety, insomnia, cardiovascular disease, even cancer is kind of from this culture of envy in social media. And so I'm thinking, you know, that's a whole nother subject that you could probably, you know, rabbit hole that one, you know,
That's
quite a long way. But anyway, so just a couple of oh by the ways that we kind of zoomed past on the previous one there. So okay, that's it.
And
So I
now,
have a question.
go
So
ahead.
that passage about love is this and love is that, and you read at weddings, it sounded like, at least in the version I'm reading, that it was meant for the church, not for the.
That's correct. It wasn't written for couples in love committing their lives to each other. It was written for the church. This is how a community is to live together. Right. And you know, and you can read how the community was fighting and making factions, and we're better than you, and concepts of envy and stuff. And Paul's saying this has nothing in it. If you know, it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter who baptized you. What matters is that you have love. All these other things mean nothing if you don't have love. So yeah. Yep. So whenever I'm in a wedding and they want that scripture read, you know, and then I'm supposed to say some wisdom or something. So I talk to the couple a little bit, and then I step around the couple and I say to the congregation, but really, it wasn't written for couples. It was written for community. And this is how we're supposed to treat each other. Right. So
One thing in those weddings I always wanted to hear was to have people that have been married a long time come up with specific examples of those specific things that are mentioned. Love is yada yada yada. Here's an example of that. Love is yada yada. Here's an example of that. So you hear from couples who have done that, been there. What does that really mean? What does that really take? What are the sacrifices that are made? Are you really ready to step up to the plate and make those not just words but actions and, you know, stories in your life? So
a good idea, David.
one of these days.
Very nice. Okay, well, let's turn our attention to 2 Corinthians, and we'll just kind of walk through it a little bit. What I like to do is just go chapter by chapter and see if there's anything that in those chapters jumped out at you and just touched your heart with beauty, or you went, what? Or you thought, wow, I need to really reflect on that for my life. I'm not sure. I might need to make some adjustments in how I've been doing things, right? How I've been walking. So anything like that. So we'll just start with chapter 1. Anything in chapter 1 that you looked at it and went, that's really cool. Or what?
Well, in 9, you know, when it talks about how that they I guess 8 too, 8 and 9, how they were so utterly and unbearably weighed down and crushed that they despaired of living. That really touched me. I really I have that one underlined and marked. And
right. And it's really, really hugely important to think about that this is Paul, who is still today one of the largest influences in bringing people to Jesus, right? And a man of deep faith. And yet, this was one of the experiences. I mean, it didn't just happen one time, but there were so many of these challenges that seemed overwhelming that it bogged him down, bogged the people he was traveling with. They just felt this despair. I mean, you can imagine fighting the wild beasts, right? You just feel this despair that it could sink on them, right? And so I want to point out this. We talked about this at 2:00, but the concept there. Are you familiar with the prosperity gospel?
oh,
right. the prosperity gospel basically says that when Jesus says you should have abundant life, then it's kind of materialistic. And so if you have a lot of possessions, it means that, you know, God wants you to have them, because God wants you to have abundant life, and it shows that you're good with God, right? And
Well, you should see the clutter in our house. We must really be tight. I mean,
but here, when we read what Paul is saying, are we then does that mean that Paul was not good with God, was not tight? Or is there, you know, a fallacy, a thing that it's pleasing to our ears to hear, but it has really nothing to do with life walking with God? Because I mean, Jesus hung on a cross. That was that wasn't pleasant, right? Not ever, when you're walking with Jesus, when you're walking with God, you're not always just going to have good stuff happening all the time. Sometimes you can be a very faithful person and still just feel overwhelmed, right?
I was in one of those churches, and I think the worst thing about it, well, if something bad happens to you, people say you did something wrong, you didn't pray, you know, so that's one part. But probably the worst thing is that you don't mature. So then when bad things, and that happens to everybody, bad things happen, right? And so you've got nothing to stand on, because you have not matured. You're just a baby, because God just showers you with blessings, and there's something wrong with you if it's not happening.
Right. Yeah. I mean, a lot of times you're kind of ostracized. Ooh, I don't know what they're doing, but I don't want it to rub off on me. And sometimes people are even asked to leave the church because bad things are happening to them, rather than the community coming around and walking with you and, you know, being this patient and kind and loving and not jealous or boastful or envious or rude. They're just, you know, it's not that. That's not the community. We only want happy stuff here. If you're not happy, then we don't need you here. And sometimes I read that still kind of online. You know, I've gotten to a place in my life where I'll read this online, not my statement. I'll read it online. Somebody will be saying, I've come to a place in my life where I realize that people don't make me happy. I just cut them out of my life. I'm like, well, well, where's the love of God in that? It's like, you know, I mean, there's a certain amount of boundaries, you know, trying to encourage people to make healthy boundaries is one thing, but just, you know, cut out of your life anybody who doesn't make you happy is like, well, how are we ever going to carry the good news to people who are living in despair if, well, you're not making me happy, so I don't want anything to do with you?
There would be no one left.
Right, exactly. So, you know, the difference between learning how to make healthy boundaries and setting healthy boundaries for yourself, and not having anything to do with people who don't make you happy. Like, it's not the same thing. Not at all. So anyway, that just made me think about that, and the churches that like the happy and don't want to actually look at what Paul says about what his life was like. Imagine what they would do with Paul. Right. I'm sorry, you must not be good with the Lord. You must not have prayed enough. Interesting, huh? Yeah, we don't, you know, and we don't, like, if you were to ask people, can you tell me anything from 2 Corinthians? Most people wouldn't be able to, right? And I probably would right off. I wouldn't remember that the treasure in earthen vessels is in. It's one of my favorite parts. I wouldn't remember that was in 2 Corinthians right off. But most people wouldn't be able to tell you that. But even if they were reading it, a lot of people will skip right over that. So thank you for lifting that up, Delphine, how important that is for people to recognize that even people of deep faith can have those moments of despair and the feelings of hopelessness. Yeah, thank you. What other kinds of things? Anything else we want to look at in chapter 1?
I'm reading the Message and it doesn't give me lines.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, but there's a line that says it was God who kept his focus on God.
Mm-hmm.
And compromise, and not trying to read between the lines or explain it away.
Okay.
I really like that line. when I start focusing too much on the problem
Mhm.
or the good, doesn't matter. I'm not focused on God. And that is in Corinthians.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, anyone else have something from the first chapter?
What was the story? It says something about an affliction because of trouble in Asia. And
Oh, okay,
what's
so
going on there?
Asia, in biblical times, Asia is Turkey.
Okay, Anatolia. Got it.
So yeah, so when they're talking about the provinces in Asia, they're speaking about Turkey. What we
Isn't
can,
that kind of where Paul was from? Isn't Tarsus sort of marginally kind of Turkey-ish, sort of?
I believe so. Yeah, yeah. I don't think it's all the way over to Greece, and or
Kind of on the eastern side, anyway.
yeah. So yeah,
Oh, so there's some problem up there.
right, right. And you know, when we read through, because part of one of the things, and hopefully as we go through the New Testament, we'll go back and refresh our memories on all these different things. But a lot of the places, like when he's saying he's writing from Ephesus, that was in Turkey. And Ephesus was leveled by earthquakes. It was leveled in military battles and rebuilt and then leveled through earthquakes. I don't know if you're aware, there's lots of earthquakes in that area of the world. And so the city was rebuilt nearby. So there's still a faith community that can really kind of trace its heritage back to the church in Ephesus, but there isn't a church in Ephesus because the town was leveled through earthquakes. But that, you know, when it was leveled, the faith community moved a few miles down the road and rebuilt, but we don't think of it about in that way. But anyway, as we go through, let's make a point to be sure and look at where these places are. So most of Paul's travels were in the areas of Turkey and kind of the eastern side of Greece. He did travel some, but mostly in the eastern side of Greece and in the western side of what is now modern day Turkey and kind of that area. A lot of travels in there. Okay, so let's look at chapter 2. What did you like in chapter 2? Anything that jumped out at you or that we need to talk about? Okay, let's go ahead and look at chapter 3. What kinds of things do we have in chapters 3? Well, I absolutely love chapter 4. And chapter 4 is set up at the end of chapter 3. so let's go ahead and take
Well, wasn't he was trying to say that they were back when they were reading in the Moses way, that they couldn't see what he was trying to say and what he was trying to teach him, that they had a veil over their face because they were reading in the Old Testament, you know, and Paul was trying to teach him the new ways that Jesus was.
Right. So probably he wasn't thinking so much of the Old Testament as the Old Covenant, right? And the new covenant that he's talking about, the new, like you're saying.
Right. Right. Sorry.
Yeah. But so yeah, so he's talking about how when Moses talked with God directly, how his face kind of glowed and it kind of freaked people out. so they asked him to put the veil over and so that they couldn't see the glory, right? That's when you read in the Old Testament, they're like, oh my gosh, you look kind of can you cover your face for us? You know, so that it veiled from them the glory of God. And then as he, you know, the longer he was away from the mountain in that experience, the less his skin glowed. And then if he would go back up to the mountain and commune with God, he would come back down and he would veil his face again, because it would kind of freak them out. So on the one side, the people were saying, we don't want to see that. It's just kind of too freaky. And on the other side, Paul is saying that Moses had a vanity and he didn't want people to see that the glory was fading. So there was this veil that prevented people from seeing clearly what was going on. But then moving it further metaphorically, then talking about that so many people have a veil that when you talk with people, they can't see this glory. And only people, there's a point at which the veil can be torn in two, right? Where the veil is rolled back, where the veil is opened up, and then you catch a new glimpse, and then you go, oh, I can see it. But until that happens, whatever, in chapter 4, he talks more about it. And that's why I'm like, the bottom of chapter 3 leads into that, where he's talking about with unveiled faces at the bottom of chapter 3. All of us with unveiled faces can see this, right? And then it goes on into chapter 4, talking about how the gods, or lowercase g, or the spirits, depending on your translation, the influences of this world, the values, the underlying assumptions of what is important, that can keep us from having our understanding being blocked, and we're not able to see how the good news is good news. It doesn't seem to make sense. Particularly, I think, things like the prosperity gospel, part of the reason it's so appealing is because it makes sense to our human minds. If you're good, you get rewarded, right? And versus Paul, when Paul says, I came to you preaching Christ and him crucified, right? Foolishness to the Jews and a stumbling block to the Gentiles. It makes no sense. Why would this be good news, and who would want to be part of this? Right? When I'm good, I'm supposed to get good things. And what you're telling me is when I'm good, I'm still going to have bad things. What? Right? Which is simply being honest about life. Right? There isn't anyone who doesn't have bad things happen, who doesn't have challenges that they no matter how faithful. And so when people start to be honest, when that veil is opened up and they start to be honest, there's this freedom in it. And Paul's talking about there at the end of chapter 3. There's this freedom of being able to be honest. And how many people have struggled with the secret, right? You didn't want anybody to know. And it just is such a burden, isn't it, to carry that secret around? You don't want anyone to know it, because if they know it, they're going to ask you to leave. They're going to kick you out, right? And so you try to pretend to be perfect. You try to have no faults. You always have to be happy. You always have to present this facade of being perfect, right? I mean, if you didn't grow up in a family like that, which I didn't grow up in a family that way. If you didn't grow up in a family like that, the stories, you know people whose lives have been so damaged because they had to be so perfect. They always had to present the perfect image. I mean, people wanted that from me because my dad was a pastor, and sometimes growing up, people would say to me, well, you sure don't act like a pastor's daughter. Right? And since my parents hadn't put on this expectation that I shouldn't be a human, right? That they just, I'm Jeanette and I am who I am. And they never put on an expectation that I should behave some way because my dad's a pastor. They didn't put that on me, but other people tried to. Well, you sure don't act like a pastor's daughter. And my counter to that was, yes, I do, because I am, and this is how I act. There's no other way for me to act. I'm a pastor's daughter. This is how I act. And, but for them, it was a challenge then, right? Because I was supposed to be absolutely perfect and, just all sweetness and light. And, I have humor, but sweetness and light isn't the way anybody's ever described me. So, yeah. So but you probably know people whose parents maybe always wanted them to be perfect. And you'll see that especially with politicians, right? Their children have to be perfect. And the illness that breeds. So this concept that we can pull the veil back and see the truth and it sets us free is just wonderful and beautiful to me anyway. So let's read this part together then. Let's look at, we're in chapter 3. So we're talking, so the part that Delphine was talking about is starting around verse 7. So in the Message, it's going to talk about, somehow it's going to be talking about the words that were chiseled onto stone tablets or written in stone. Okay, who would like to read from verse 7 through, let's go to let's do 7 verses through 7 through 13. Who could read 7 through 13 for us? Okay, David.
Got it right here. Now, if the ministry of death, chiseled in letters on stone tablets, came in glory so that the people of Israel could not gaze at Moses' face because of the glory of his face, a glory now set aside, how much more will the ministry of the Spirit come in glory? For if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, much more does the ministry of justification abound in glory. Indeed, what once had glory has lost its glory because of the greater glory. For if what was set aside came through glory, much more has the permanent come in glory. Since then we have such a hope, we act with great boldness, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to keep the people of Israel from gazing at the end of the glory that was being set aside, but their minds were hardened. Whoops. Okay, finished. There's a lot of glory going on there. Wow. That's
Sorry. So what do
a lot of glory.
Are you following the glory that he's talking about? Sometimes when he keeps repeating it, it can lose the continuity, right? Are you following what he's talking about?
I lost track.
So let me just say this. Let me say it a different way. So maybe this is a silly example, but maybe, you order at a restaurant some kind of a dish. Maybe we'll just say we're having ice cream and somebody orders some butter pecan and people taste it and go, oh man, this is really good. And then comes the butter pecan in flaming flambe. And everybody's like, oh, right? You've seen that, whereas something's really good. And then the next thing you're like, oh, that's even better, right? So that's what he's talking about, that he's talking about the tablets, right? That came down from the mountain that carried the law. And he's trying to help people understand that on the one side, the law was given to us to help us be able to live well in the land, right? We talked about that Sunday, Pastor Peter's sermon, talking about the 10 commandments were to help us to be able to have abundant life. If you follow these, you will have abundant life. They're not meant to confine you, but you will have abundant life. But humans, being such as we are, it ended up being a death sentence. It became a weight and a burden, and we kept adding to it and making it so it was impossible to follow. But these originally, they came down and they came in glory, and Moses was aglow, right? We were talking about people, they didn't want to look at him because he kind of looked freaky. He was just glowing from this, literally glowing from the experience of this encounter with God. And these stone tablets that really carried death for us, if they came in glory, how much more is the glory of this amazing message of God's grace and salvation, right? What a greater glory is this, right? We thought that was really good, but once that veil is pulled back and you really understand this message of salvation that Jesus brought to us, that Paul is sharing with us, when you really see that, it's incomparable. That glory is just so astounding. so much brighter. Another just silly example, I was watching the British Bake Off. Anybody watch the British Bake Off? And so, you know, have you it, you know, right? So they bake stuff and then the judges taste it and tell you stuff. And so the judge tastes it. He's like, oh, this is so good, right? And then he goes and he tastes this other one. He's like, wow, this is so good. If I hadn't just had that other one, I would have said, this is amazing. But that other one is just a little bit more, right? So the backwards, right? So if you get the one and you say, wow, this is amazing. And then the next one is even more amazing, right? It's just, oh, just so much better. You taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh, wow, that's amazing. So this is that glory, right? So if glory came, the first one was just imagine how much more is this glory of salvation that you can see when the veil is rolled away. Which then again, just you guys will hold this a little bit. It'll echo back then when we get to Holy Week. And it talks about the veil being ripped, right? That veil being ripped, which is talking about in the temple, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, right? It was the veil that closed off the Holy of Holies, that area that was really sacred from the common people, where only the priests could go in, and you only got to go in by drawing, right? By drawing straws, essentially showed which one was God's chosen one to get to go into that Holy of Holies. And then it talks about the temple, the curtain in the temple was torn in two when Jesus died, right? That barrier between God and humans was torn away, right? That veil is rolled back for us. But sometimes we have a hard time really moving into that glory. We kind of, oh, that's too much. We want the veil to stay in place because we can handle that. We can't handle the fullness of that glory. Lots of fun metaphors in there to explore and think about. Okay, anything else in chapter 3? We're almost done with our day today. Shall we go ahead and look at chapter 4 then? Because this is the treasure in clay jars, right? That is just, you guys know that, right? You knew that before you read this. You went, oh yeah, this is where it is, right? Chapter 4, 2 Corinthians. I just love the image of this. How many people here enjoy pottery, enjoy looking at pottery, right? Right. And this concept, part of the beauty of this concept is that these earthen jars, they don't show the glory unless they're broken. Right? I mean, you have an earthen jar, you put a light inside it, you can't see anything. There has to be holes in it. There has to be gaps in it for the glory to shine out. And so that's part of, you know, we're not metal, we're not gold, we're not something that's unbreakable. We're these earthen jars that will break, and that glory shines through those places. So it's one of the, you know, kind of stupid churchy pun jokes is that we all need to be crackpots, right? Only the crackpot can really, the glory of God can show through our lives. But that veil, that the freedom to be honest, right? To show through the brokenness and allow God's glory to shine through there. That is a huge gift. I've seen this a lot, and I'm going to guess that you have too, that there'll be somebody that they're, as a group of people who know each other well, but there never seems that real deep bond isn't there yet. And then somebody will be honest enough and vulnerable enough to let the true self shine through. And when they do that, it gives everybody else the freedom to also do that. Like Delphine was talking about, it's never going to happen in those churches. They're never going to be able to have that depth because they can't. They can't they want to be the solid earthen jar, but the glory doesn't show through then. But those places where I've had people say to me, you know, I didn't want to tell people that, Pastor, because I thought if anybody knew this about my past, they would ask me to leave. And I love this community and I didn't want to have to leave. And, but you asked me to tell my story, and I did, and people were like, wow, I'm so glad you said that. That's so powerful and so beautiful. I had that experience too. And they're like, what? People, our brokenness and the secrets that we feel such shame to share. Yes, go ahead, David.
So it's coming up on Halloween, and we carve pumpkins and we
Yes.
put lights in the pumpkins.
Right.
And depending on the carving, different light comes out and you see different things that literally weren't there before.
Yeah.
So instead of cracked pots,
Yes.
we're carved pumpkins.
There we go. There we go. And that's one of those metaphors too about that Jesus takes all the muck out of the inside and cleans you up and puts a light inside to shine. Right. So, right. And plus
That we can understand. Yeah.
right. Okay. What else? Anything else in chapter 4 we want to talk about? We're coming up on our hour.
Well, he does in verse 16 when he talks about our outer man is progressively decaying, but our inner self is being progressively renewed day after day. That's really powerful, especially as we get older.
Yes. Yes, especially because when you're younger and you feel like you're getting older. How many people here listen to people in their 30s talk about being old? You're like, what? I've heard that. I'm just like looking at people thinking, you think you're old? You're in your 30s. What are you talking about? But we feel like, but then when you actually get to those places where literally your body is wearing out, the mortal is mortal, and you become more daily aware of this. But that inner beauty, right? Say it again. What was the verse there? Read it for us again.
Though our outer man is progressively decaying and wasting away, yet our inner self is being progressively renewed day after day. So don't be discouraged. Don't be exhausted. Don't be wearied out.
What verse is that again?
16, chapter 4, 16. I got an amplified Bible, so it's got a lot of extra words.
Right.
It's interesting too how important a clay jar was back then. They used them for shipping, for storing, for hiding things, all water, their daily life. They always had the jars. So if you broke a jar, it was a big thing back then. So the metaphor of the jar and how fragile it is and what's so special inside, it all hooks all together.
Yes, it does. Beautiful. Okay, so before we sign off, I also always like to take a time to just acknowledge that we're from different congregations and allow people to share if there's something going on at your congregation that might be fun for others to come and join in and let us know about it. So what kind of things are going on in our congregations?
We have our storefront. It's the first Saturday of the month. Right now we have old costumes for Halloween that we used to do in our variety shows. We're full up. We can't take any more donations, but we have just a variety of stuff to come down and just check it out.
So that's going to happen this next weekend? Or did it just happen?
No, I think we missed the Saturday, But just, if your church does variety shows or anything like that, we used to have tea and classics, just all kinds of shows where people would dress up in different outfits and we'd make little skits. But the folks that used to do that are kind of getting up there. I'm not going to say old, because my 42-year-old daughter says I'm old.
Well, but we remember that even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day, right? So we're holding on to that. But so the first Saturday of November will be another, is it like a sale there at the church in Forestville?
It's 9 to 1. Just come in, everything's marked. I'm sure you can negotiate. We're not that hard. But it's fun. And then when we have our tea and classics, I'll let you guys know. You might want to come to Forestville and see our little thing that we do.
Okay, that sounds fun. Nancy, is there anything going on at Christchurch?
Well, they, sorry, they have an ongoing Elijah's Pantry
Okay, yes.
open for the whole community to join in and help. We could use the help.
Okay.
And it's been running for about 17 years.
Great.
And it feeds the families in the community on Thursdays.
Okay.
So that's one thing that I'm really excited about.
Nice. Okay.
They're doing a change-making series at on Sundays.
Oh, right. Yeah. Very good.
So there's a couple of, and plus book groups that are fun.
Great. Okay, David, Delphine, anything you want to lift up from First Church?
Well, we have this great Bible study.
Right.
Kids put that together. Wow. We got a harvest festival coming up on the 21st, Saturday the 21st. It's kind of aimed at kids, but it's very fun. People come in costumes, play silly little games. There's prizes and food, and it's just a fun afternoon. It's free. Anyone can come. So a couple weeks from Saturday, a week from Saturday on the 21st, we're like 10 days out.
You need like candy donations or anything like that, or
definitely can use candy donations. Definitely. Yeah. Very fun. All right. Well, I think let's all read this as a beautiful benediction together. Let's read for 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. Whatever translation you have, and for Nancy, where it's not marked exactly what verses, where it's the verse about our mortal bodies wasting away, but the inner body being renewed. Okay, so whatever translation you have, let's read it together. Even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. Who else has it? Read it, whatever version you got. David, read it for us.
it's exactly the same.
What you're saying?
It's word for word what you just said.
Delphine's too?
No, mine, but I've read mine twice, so.
Go ahead, read it again for us.
Therefore, we do not become discouraged, utterly spiritless, exhausted, wearied out through fear. Though our outer man is progressively decaying and wasting away, yet our inner self is being progressively renewed day after day.
Beautiful, beautiful,
Poetic.
beautiful. Nancy, did you find it in the message?
Even though on the outside it often looks like things are falling apart on us, on the inside where God is making new life, not a day goes by without his unfolded grace.
Robin, did you find it in your translation? You're you're muted, yeah.
I have the same as David does and you do.
Wonderful. Okay. So, God, we're grateful for this time together. We're grateful for the reminder that even when we are feeling frail, that you are perfecting us inside. Help us to allow that glory to shine through so that others might be blessed with not our beautiful and amazing personalities, but really with your love shining through our lives to help make our world a better place, to reach past the brokenness of what we can see, to polish that inner beauty of the spirit. God, as we start to wind down this day, we ask that you would help us just to snuggle into your warm embrace and rock us to sleep so that we sleep soundly through the night. Awaken us tomorrow so that we might find ways to share your love with others. So every day what we say and what we do can make a good witness for Jesus. We lift the prayer to you in his name and in the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen.
And
Thank you,
Okay,
Jeanette.
look forward to seeing you
thank
next.
you so much.
Amen. Bye, everybody.
See you
I
next
love you, everybody.
Love you too,
week,
Rob.
Robin.
Good to see you.